What was your inspiration for the game, this specific game, which famously ended in a 29-29 tie?
Well, I was at the game. I was only 14 years old at the time. I was with my parents, and it was a famous game because it was such an exciting game. Both teams were undefeated coming into the game for the first time since 1909. Yale was ranked 16th in the country, ahead of Alabama and Nebraska.
Wow.
So it was a big game. It was an exciting game. Harvard scored 16 points in the final 42 seconds to tie Yale 29-29. But the fact that it took place in 1968 is what interested me. If it had been played in 1958 or 1978 or 1988, I wouldn't have written the book.
Right.
But to me, this extraordinary tie between these two arch-rival schools seemed to be this kind of miraculous truce in the midst of what was a polarized and sort of a watershed year in American history.
And we'll get to that in just a second. When it ended with a famous headline in the Harvard Crimson: Harvard beats Yale 29-29.
Yes.
So I guess what was sort of the story behind that?
Well, you have to understand that Yale was favored by a touchdown, but everybody thought Yale was going to beat Harvard by at least 3 touchdowns. And they raced out to a 22-0 lead. They were ahead by 16 points late in the fourth quarter. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Harvard came back to tie in the final second absolutely stunned the entire Yale team, the entire Yale. They were like statues after that happened. Whereas the Harvard fans were exultant. 5,000 Harvard fans had left early because they thought there was no hope, including then Governor John Volpe. But they poured down onto the field. They were jumping up and down, hugging each other. Everybody was so excited. So to Harvard, it felt like a victory. Right. To Yale, it felt like a defeat. So the Crimson headline, Harvard beats Yale 29-29, captured the emotional reality of what took place on the field.
Right. So can you set a bit of a picture for us? And you mentioned this. This was more than just a football game. What was happening in the world at this time?
Well, in 1968, of course, was really a watershed year in American history. Just a few things that went on. Assassination of Martin Luther King followed 9 weeks later by the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Right. Democratic National Convention in which unarmed protesters were beaten by Mayor Daley's, cops. It was the year of the Tet Offensive, right. And in Vietnam. And really, Vietnam was the big story that year. It's the year that Richard Nixon was elected. So many things going on, more than 100 inner-city riots, more than 12 college campus takeovers by radical students, and so forth. So to me, this 29-29 tie seemed something of an extraordinary event.
Right, we have a picture here on the screen. This is an actual picture of police on Harvard Yard after a student occupation, correct?
Yes, this took place actually 4 months after the game in April of 1969. Right. And 2 of the Harvard players, in fact, were members of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and they were part of the group that actually occupied University Hall, Harvard's main administration building, largely to protest the war in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And the then Harvard president, Nathan Pusey, called in the police, the Cambridge police and the state troopers, and after the students had occupied the building for one night, those students were dragged out of the building by the cops. Wow. And the state troopers, and including those 2 Harvard football players, and some of them were clubbed, I would say, right. By the policemen. So, and that picture is absolutely an extraordinary picture because that was after the students had been taken out of the building, and they were there kind of keeping order, because in the background you'll see lots of Harvard students who are shouting and screaming because they'd never seen police enter Harvard Yard and forcibly drag students out.
And this wasn't necessarily an uncommon occurrence at the time. A similar incident had happened at Columbia.
The previous year,
right,
yes.
Right.
In fact, there are many people who feel that the Harvard SDS group was determined to sort of one-up Columbia and have their own big event. So
that's just to clarify, that's Students for Democratic Society.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So that was a major event from which historians said, it took Harvard at least a decade sort of to recover from that takeover. Because leading up to it, it had happened, as you mentioned, at these other campuses, including most notably at Columbia, but everybody said, oh, this could never happen at Harvard. Harvard was seen as kind of the be-all, end-all in those days of the universities. And it was believed that the close student-faculty relationships and so forth, the dormitory system they had at Harvard of the different dorms would render Harvard immune to this kind of thing. It could never happen at Harvard. In fact, I think it was the Christian Science Monitor had a headline that intimated if it could happen at Harvard, no one is safe from this kind of thing.
Right. I just want to give a quick reminder that if you have any questions you can ask, you can send us your comments or questions on Facebook and Twitter. I just want to get to go back real quickly to this. You talked to a lot of the people involved with the game for the book. Was there a sense that what was going on outside of the football fields was playing into what these players from both sides were feeling about sort of the seriousness of this contest?
Absolutely. Every player that I interviewed 54 of the players, and every one of them was affected in some way by the mid-'60s, but a large number of them were putting their heads down, doing their studying and playing football, and they were only tangentially affected. But Harvard, for instance, one of the players had already served in Vietnam, had served 9 months in combat in Vietnam, and then returned to take part in this game. 2 of the Harvard players were members of SDS. 4 of them were members of ROTC, which is the Reserve Officers Training Corps, which was training training college students to become officers in the war in Vietnam. On the Yale side, there were a number of anti-war, people who were players, a number of ROTC people, and so forth. So, although many of the players didn't participate necessarily in these, stuff that was going on around them,
right,
they were all affected in some way by it.
Right, and I just want to give get a sort of better sense of what this sort of contest meant at the time. Right now you're probably not going to see Harvard and Yale on Saturday night ABC college football, but at the time, these were powerhouses, right?
Well, powerhouses, relatively speaking. Harvard and Yale, if you go back, to the beginnings of college football, although they didn't play the first college football game, they were 5 years too late for that. Rutgers and Princeton played the first one in 1869. Mm-hmm. Harvard and Yale first played in 1874, and they pretty much made the modern game of football. They made the rules, they won the national championships, traded off back and forth practically up until 1925. But after that, some of the other, Ohio State, Notre Dame, and all of those colleges came to the fore. But in the mid-'60s, Yale had such a good team that they were, nationally ranked. They're 67 and 68 teams.
Yeah.
As I said, 16th in the country. So the other thing was that back then, college football, both nationally and particularly in Boston, was huge.
Right.
There were no New England Patriots then. There was the Boston Patriots, but nobody went to their game.
It was bigger than NFL.
Oh, it was exponentially more exciting than the NFL. The New York Times would send 2 reporters to the Harvard-Yale game. The Boston Globe sent 6 reporters. There were stories, at least 2 or 3 stories in all the Boston papers in the week leading up to the game about the Harvard-Yale game.
Yeah.
It was huge.
In this particular year, Yale's quarterback, Brian Dowling, he was sort of the creme de la creme of quarterbacks, and we have a picture of him right there. In fact, the joke was that the Yale students called him God, right?
Yes, and at one point, one evening before, I think it was the Princeton game, a group of hundreds of students assembled under his dormitory window and said, "We want God, we want God." And he came to the balcony and opened his window, and he apparently crushed orange. The Princeton colors were orange.
Yeah.
And the students went wild. He was an extraordinary player, and the fact that he went to Yale was almost the most extraordinary thing of all. He was recruited by nearly 100 colleges, including Ohio State, Notre Dame, USC.
Wow.
He could have played in the same backfield with O.J. Simpson.
Wow.
They were in the same class. And he was an extraordinary player, and when he came to Yale, when he announced his decision, it was headline news in the Cleveland Plain Dealer that he was going to go to Yale. It was praised as the triumph of education over big-time athletics.
Wow. So the other thing I was thinking about, heading into that matchup was, only about a month before the Summer Olympics had actually taken place in Mexico City, which technically, yes, summer, but because of I think it was because of weather, they moved it into October.
Yes.
And that's where the famous protest by John Carlos and Tommy Smith happened, where they both raised their fist during the national anthem when they're on the medal stand. So was there, I guess, a sense of what that happened and how athletes were thinking about that, there was also a famous picture of two Yale cheerleaders who made a similar pose, right?
Yes, I was
And
amazed when I
right.
came across this photo in the yearbook that year, in the Yale College yearbook. So this was taken at the Dartmouth game 2 weeks after the Mexico City Olympics, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith made their protest on the stand. So there are the two African-American cheerleaders of Yale raising their own black glove fist in homage to Carlos and Smith.
And this was also during the national anthem.
This was during the national anthem. You can see the Yale players lined up behind. Wow. I tried to find out from the Yale players what they thought of this, but none of them had noticed it. They all seemed to have their heads bowed. But the alumni of Yale, at least some of them, were absolutely outraged that this could take place on the sainted Yale Bowl field.
Right.
That and they demanded that these two students be kicked out, and of course they were not.
Yeah.
In large measure because, well, it would have been ridiculous for them to be kicked out.
Right.
But,
although we saw, with essentially that's what happened to Carlos and Smith. They were shunned from the Olympic Village.
Yes.
There was a huge negative reactions when they got back.
I think people who were not alive in 1968 can't understand the magnitude of the reaction to the Smith-Carlos protest.
Right.
And of course, 50 years later, we have Colin Kaepernick kneeling in protest for the national anthem. So
there's a lot of parallels. Yeah. So one of the questions that we had from the audience, which I want to get into the actual game itself. How big this was played at Harvard Stadium, right here on the Boston Cambridge border. What were the stands looking like? How many fans were in attendance?
Well, the stadium at that point held something close to 40,000 people. Unfortunately, Harvard had dismantled. They used to seat closer to 60,000 people, but years ago, when football wasn't doing so well at Harvard, they took down some of those stands. But they erected as many extra stands in the open end of the stadium as they could. They had people standing around the edges. I remember they looked sort of like vultures standing on the top of the stadium. I was worried they would fall off. So the ticket seller for Harvard estimated that he could have sold at least 100,000 tickets to that game.
Wow.
And tickets were going for as much as $300 on the sort of black market. The face value of the ticket was $6. So, and $300 back then was, I think, 1/10 of Harvard tuition. So some of the Harvard players, although it's against the law to scalp tickets, they were warned by their coach not to scalp them. They couldn't resist.
Wow. Yeah.
And one of the players in particular was very disappointed because although he scalped one of his tickets, I think, for $200, the other one he'd already promised to his pediatrician. He was married and he had a child, and he'd promised that to his pediatrician in lieu of a payment. So at the time, the $6 face value didn't seem like much, but when he realized it was worth $300.
Right. So for most of the actual contest, it was Yale in front, correct?
Steamrolled Harvard, absolutely. For 56 and a half minutes, pretty much.
Wow. So now correct me if I'm wrong, so Yale had a 29-13 lead with under a minute left.
Yes, absolutely, with 42 seconds left.
Wow. So can you take me through, well, just from your memory, how much do you remember of what happens?
I thought I remembered a lot of what happened, but I didn't. I've probably watched the actual game film 10 or 15 times. And, like many of the Harvard players, when they watch that game film, they say, I don't understand how we did it. I still don't think it's going to work out that way. How could we score that many points in that short a time? And each time I see the film, I have that same reaction. Gee, how are they going to do this? And of course, what happened is, with about 3 minutes to go, Harvard had the ball back on its own, I think, 15-yard line, and through this amazing confluence of events, these sort of questionable penalties on Yale, lucky bounces, and so forth, they went down the field and scored with exactly 42 seconds left, and that brought it to 29-19. Then they made the two-point conversion. Then they had kicked an onside kick, which has usually only 1 in 5 chance of succeeding. They recovered the onside kick. They marched down the field, scored again, and time ran out midway through the final play. But they scored, and of course, by the rules, they were entitled to go for a two-point conversion, even though time had run out.
Wow.
And so they tied at 29-29.
And this was before overtime had been implemented in
Yes.
the NCAA.
In 1996, I believe, the NCAA said there will be no more ties.
Wow.
We're going to always have overtime. So there will never be another tie college football game.
Yeah.
And so in my feeling, there may never be a game that could end in such symmetry
Yeah.
the way this one did.
Yeah, so, and there it is, the famous Harvard Crimson headline.
Yes.
Harvard beats Yale 29-29. Was that sort of the sense that, again, even though it was a tie, and there was this famous, this sort of idea, and that led to this famous headline that this was a victory for Harvard and really a defeat for Yale?
Well, I'll tell you a story that points that out. You may know the great Yale and Dallas Cowboy halfback Calvin Hill.
Yeah.
Who was
I'm from Dallas, so
oh, okay.
yeah,
Well,
100%.
then you know him well then, because he was so disappointed by what had happened in the game and so crestfallen that he decided not to go back to Yale on the team bus.
Mm-hmm.
He just said, "I'm just too disappointed about this." So he went to find a party at Harvard, and he ended up spending the weekend at Harvard, or the night at Harvard. Went back the next day, and on Monday morning, he woke up and opened up the Yale Daily News, and it said, Harvard and Yale tie 29-29. He had thought until that moment that Yale had lost because
Wow.
the entire team in the locker room was so depressed.
Wow.
All of the fans, Yale fans, were so depressed. He just assumed that Yale had lost and Harvard had won, and it wasn't until he read it in the paper 2 days later
Wow.
that the reality set in. And he said he was a little bit recompensed because he realized that Yale had in fact tied, and they tied for the Ivy League title.
Wow. So was the story the opposite then in the Harvard locker room?
Absolutely. It was absolute pandemonium in the Harvard locker room. Everybody was trying to squeeze in. Everybody was screaming and shouting. They couldn't really believe what had gone on either.
Right.
I was talking to some of the people who had attended the game the other night after reading, and they talked about the sense of fate, the hand of God, deus ex machina kinds of things. And the players all use these terms as well, that at a certain point in the game with those 42 seconds, everything seemed to be going Harvard's way. Nothing was going Yale's way, and it was as if some larger force had descended.
Yeah. So, with these teams who at the time had a much more large, significant chunk of the national attention when it came to football, what was sort of the outside reaction to what had happened?
Well, one has to keep it in perspective. The fact is that the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and many of the major newspapers at the time were dominated by Harvard and Yale and Ivy League writers and editors. So they had it wasn't quite the meritocratic institution. And so they had a overweening interest in this. But can you imagine that on the front page of the New York Times sports page, the lead headline was Harvard and Yale tie 29-29.
Yeah.
Ohio State beats Michigan for the national championship. And on one half was the Harvard quarterback Frank Champe, who led the team back to the tie.
Yeah.
And the other picture was of Woody Hayes, the famous Ohio State coach, being carried off the field by his players. So this was seen as every bit as important as the national championship.
Yeah. Wow. So you mentioned Calvin Hill, and that brought me to another thing I want to talk about, because his intention, one of his dreams, was to be the first black quarterback at Yale, right?
Yes.
And that didn't happen. What was there for him? Was there sort of disappointments in that he looked back on?
Yes. He was very disappointed. In fact, a group of his African-American friends who were more radical than he was advised him to quit the team. And, because when he was switched from, he was an All-American high school quarterback. And when he came to Yale, he was moved to fullback. Now, I hasten to say that's probably almost entirely because of Brian Dowling. And they wanted to have Brian Dowling and Calvin Hill, the two best players, probably in the Ivy League, two of the best players in the country, the New York Times called them, in the backfield at the same time.
Right.
But he was very disappointed, and he always wondered what his life would have been like if he'd been allowed to compete for the quarterback position at Yale.
Right. But overall, that was more of again, that how this sort of contest played into the bigger picture of what was going on to the country and going out these two schools, because this was also a couple of, I forget if it was a couple of weeks before or a couple of weeks after that Yale was going to allow women into the school too.
Well, yes. Well, the following fall, 500 women would be admitted to Yale. But interestingly, that fall, the sort of thing that pushed them into coeducation a little bit more quickly than the Yale president wished to was the fact that a Yale undergraduate organized something called Co-Ed Week, in which he invited 700 women from colleges across the Northeast to come and spend a week at Yale, live in Yale dorms, take Yale courses, engage in Yale extracurricular activities and so forth. And there was real fear that this would end in all sorts of horrible things.
Right.
But it all worked out well, and a week after that, the Yale Corporation voted to admit women for the following fall.
Wow. We have a question from the audience here, which I want to get to. And just another reminder, if you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to us on Facebook and Twitter. We talked a lot about how the world surrounding this game impacted it and impacted the players. How much do you think you see what has gone on there, again, with the war and sort of students' unrest and students' dissatisfaction with society, at large, just a youth dissatisfaction with society, and racial tension, et cetera. How much do you see what happened there in 1968? How much is that parallel to now? And what have we learned? What lessons have we learned from that? And what lessons have we sort of forgot?
Well, that's a big question, but when I first began writing the book, I didn't think that it would have much relevance today. I was trying to recreate this game and this era,
right?
And then, of course, as the years went by, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, election of a polarizing president 50 years after Richard Nixon, et cetera. Right. And all of these things began. The players would say to me, "George, can you believe it? It's like 1968 all over again." And so what can we learn from the fact that some of these things were being worked on 50 years ago? I'm not sure, but a woman I was speaking to yesterday after a reading had a very interesting point, and that was that in 68, a large part of the conflict was also intergenerational. You remember, never trust anyone over 30.
Right.
It was, we're young.
Right.
Everybody over 30 has screwed up our country, and we can change it for the better. And at least to my knowledge, maybe now that I'm on the over 30 side, we don't seem to have that same intergenerational fight,
right.
Which is one hopeful thing I think about today.
Right.
So.
Yeah. One more question I think I wanted to ask you is, one of the things that was in the book, which was touched on, was that there was sort of this idea that maybe some of the players had that there should be, and that maybe they were told, is that there is this separation between sports and society, which doesn't seem true. So how much does society, from what you've read and what you've researched, what you put into this book, how much does sport affect society and vice versa? Well, that's another big question, but
I think that they're certainly interrelated, but maybe I can use this example.
Yeah.
At Harvard, the football team was not, in 1968, historically, football has always been seen as a very militaristic sport.
Right.
All the same terms are used in war and football, the blitz, the war in the trenches, and so forth.
Right.
And so in 68, football was seen as really this anachronistic sport, at least on most Ivy League campuses. But at Harvard, the football team had this diverse group of people, and football brought them together so that the SDS members and the Vietnam veteran just forgot their differences once they got out on the football team.
Right.
And in fact, one of the Harvard players told me he thought that the fact that the Harvard team was so diverse in different ways, it brought them together, that they had good karma. Yale, on the other hand, football in 67 and 68 united alumni and students and brought them together in a way that, in the book I say that hawks and doves nested side by side in the Yale Bowl. And they really did.
Yeah.
It was a diversion. It enabled people to forget. And I know a lot of people say that's the way sports should be. Oh, sports should not be infected by the larger problems of society. But
Right.
I sort of feel just the opposite, that I'm really excited to see more and more athletes standing up for what they believe in. Back in '68, there was when there was going to be a black boycott of the Olympics, it was proposed.
Right.
The famous New York Times columnist Arthur Daly wrote, "This is not the way for blacks to gain their civil rights. They should do what Jesse Owens did, compete in the Olympics and bring credit to their race," essentially is what he was saying.
Right.
And that they should shut up off the field. He didn't use that term.
Right.
And one of the Harvard players, well, 3 Harvard players, wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times and said, "We're tired of using our athletic achievements to advance our cause. We should be allowed to say what we believe, and we support this boycott of the Olympics."
Right. Last thing, George, before we go out, 50 years, over 50 years now since this famous game. What do you think its lasting impact is?
Oh, well, I guess we'll end on a hopeful note. The fact that a team could come back from 16 points with 42 seconds left, I think gives us hope. If you allow me to say this, not just in sports, but in society, that there's always a chance for things to improve, to get better, to create a tie, to create a chord between, people. So that's a little hokey, but I do believe it.
Hey, it's all good. Well, George, thank you so much. Again, the book, The Game, Harvard, Yale, and America in 1968. That's the image right there. Look for it at a bookstore, Amazon, wherever you can buy it. So, George, thanks again. Thanks to everybody who watched on Facebook, who was here with us live in the audience. And thank you again to our friends at the New England Historic Genealogical Society and their American Inspiration series for partnering with WGBH for this conversation. I'm Esteban Bustillos. Thanks again.
Thank you.